Now we go to the second formulation of the categorical imperative. A major moral implication of the formula of universalizability is the respect for person or respect for humanity. It is expressed as follow the formula of end itself. Act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. So for Immanuel Kant, persons are ends in themselves, hence they must not be used as means for other ends. What makes Kant think that persons are ends in themselves is his belief that all human beings, regardless of their accidental characteristics, for example, race or nationality, social status, age, gender, and others, equally possess inalienable dignity and rights. Any act insofar as they degrade human dignity and rights necessarily violates this formula. As one of the foundations of Kant's categorical imperative, this formula is unconditional, that is, regardless of the goodness of purpose or of consequence, any act that treats human beings as means or as a tool or as an instrument to an end is always wrong, even if people give their consent, informed or not, voluntary or forced. Treating them as mere instruments to achieve whatever ends is still morally wrong. At this point, it should be clarified that this formula does not mean that doing something for others or asking people to help us or employing them for legitimate work is a degradation of man's humanity. Kant rebukes the deliberate attempt to make man commit an unethical act or things against his will for other ends. Slavery, prostitution, and exploitation of labor are examples of which no reason could suffice to justify their morality. These acts treat persons as means and absolutely degrade man's dignity and rights. For Kant, man, and generally rational being, exists as an end in himself or herself, not merely as means to be arbitrarily used by this or that will, but all his actions, whether they concern himself or other rational beings, must be always regarded at the same time as an end. Kant therefore stresses that man is not a means to an end, he is an end in himself. This principle of humanity, however, is for Kant not derived from experience. It is all a priori. It calls for man's unconditional respect for his fellow men. Kant hates actions that lead to the dispersonalization, dehumanization, and the alienation of man. Like in the first categorical formula, applying this formula is not complicated. It only requires the asking of personal question and honesty in answering it. Before we do an act, we should ask ourselves, will my action treat myself or other persons as means to other ends? Or will my action degrade my dignity as a person or the dignity of others? If we honestly think that we will treat ourselves or other persons as means to an end, or degrade our dignity, or violate our rights, then the act is wrong, and we should refrain from doing it. If we think that the act will not treat us means or whatever end to whatever end, then the act is morally right and it would be fine to commit to do it. So we have now the case of a medical researcher in order to elaborate the second formulation of the categorical imperative, which is the value of person or of humanity. Mr. Y, as a medical researcher in the government's Food and Drugs Commission, because of his credibility and competence, he is tasked to lead a small team of researchers to study the effect on the health of popular products suspected to have caused serious health problems among many consumers. After months of study, Mr. Y confirms the suspicion. He thought that it is in the public's best interest to recommend the immediate recall and banning of the product. When Mr. Y was about to prepare the report of the study, a high-ranking government official went to see him. The official requested Mr. White to reconsider his findings so as not to damage the image of a very benevolent corporation which manufactures the product. The official assured him that the product is safe and stressed that it must stay that way. Before the official left, he made clear that Mr. Y needs to make a new and better report, otherwise he should start looking for another job. Aware that he badly needs his job, Mr. Y faces the dilemma of whether to write a truthful report or do what the government official wanted him to do, suppress the truth. What should Mr. Y do? It is clear in this particular case that Mr. Y is deliberately forced to perform an act against his will. Pressuring Mr. Y do an unethical act, that is, to suppress the truth and make fallacious pronouncements about the product, is a degradation of his human dignity. Writing a fallacious report declaring the product as safe would also mean the unfair vindication of a company which has already caused a lot of harm to people. This shows that Mr. Y treated as a means to a selfish end and not an end in himself. So, applying the second formula of the categorical imperative, act always so as to treat humanity in your own person or in that of another as an end in itself, never merely as a means, it becomes clear that writing an erroneous report is unethical. The most ethical course of action, therefore, is to write the truth about the product regardless of its consequence. As we have already noted, it is the thought of consequence of our action that forces us to opt for an unethical course of action. And in this case, it is the fear of losing one's job that will most likely distort our perception of what is good and what we ought to do. Ignoring the consequence of our act, therefore, would make us more objective in making decisions and in choosing the most ethically appropriate course of action. So that is the second formulation of Kant's categorical imperative. Next video, we will learn the critique to the deontology of Immanuel Kant.